Eleanor had 30 days to pay a debt she hadn't created. On land her father had mortgaged in secret. When the Lord sent to collect it arrived, she expected pity or contempt. She did not expect him to sit down at her kitchen table and ask to see her ledgers. She had known something was wrong for months. The bank's letters had grown shorter and colder. The tenant farmers had started asking questions she couldn't answer. But it wasn't until the solicitor's carriage rolled up the muddy lane to Ashcombe Farm, 3 weeks after her father's funeral, that Eleanor learned the full shape of the disaster he'd left behind. Her father had mortgaged the farm, twice over as it turned out, to a moneylender in the county town, using it as collateral against a series of speculative investments that had failed, one after another, with the quiet, catastrophic persistence of a slowly collapsing roof. He had told no one, not her mother, long dead, not her older sisters, both married and settled comfortably elsewhere, untouched by any of it. Only Eleanor, who had stayed. She had always stayed. While Charlotte and Beatrice were courted at county assemblies, admired for their fair hair and easy laughter, Eleanor had been the one walking the fields with her father, learning which soil held water and which drained too fast, which tenant families could be trusted with an extension on their rent and which could not. Nobody had ever called it a gift. They had called it plainness, the natural consequence of a girl too tall, too serious, too fond of numbers to be pretty. You were always more suited to the ledgers than the drawing room, her aunt had told her once, meaning it as an insult. Eleanor had taken it, silently, as the closest thing to a compliment anyone in her family had ever paid her. Now the ledgers were the only thing standing between her and losing everything. The solicitor's letter had given her 30 days before the debt came due in full, and a name. Lord Ashford Whitmore, the man whose family now held the mortgage, having purchased it from the original lender at a discount that suggested he expected to collect rather than to profit from patience. Eleanor had pictured him before he arrived, cold, indifferent, the sort of man who saw a struggling farm and a grieving daughter as nothing more than an entry on a balance sheet. She had prepared herself for pity, which she could not have borne, or contempt, which she had at least grown accustomed to. What she had not prepared for was the man who stepped down from the carriage on a gray October morning, took one look at the sagging barn roof and the overgrown hedgerow along the drive, and asked, not her steward, not any male relative she didn't have, but Eleanor herself, to see the farm's account books. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Your father's debt is considerable," Lord Whitmore said. He was younger than she had expected, dark-haired, with an unhurried, assessing manner that reminded her of the way she herself looked at a field before deciding what to plant in it. "I find it difficult to determine whether this farm can be salvaged without understanding how it has actually been run. I assume someone here keeps the accounts." "I do." "Then I should like to see them." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, waiting for the demand to reveal itself as a trap, a prelude to some humiliation. It didn't come. He simply waited, patient and unbothered by the mud clinging to his boots, for her answer. "They're not tidy," she warned him. "My father kept his own accounts separately, for the things he didn't want anyone to see. I've only just begun untangling them. I've yet to encounter a set of accounts that weren't, in some fashion, a confession." They sat at the kitchen table, not the formal parlor which had grown too shabby to receive guests in, but the kitchen warm from the stove, smelling of yesterday's bread, while Eleanor spread the ledgers across the scrubbed wood surface and began, haltingly at first, to explain what she had found. Her father's investments. The debts taken against the farm to fund them. The slow accumulation of unpaid rents from tenants he'd been too proud, or too ashamed, to pursue. The small, stubborn profits Eleanor herself had managed to wring from the dairy operation over the past 2 years, entirely separate from her father's disastrous ventures. Entries she had kept meticulously because numbers, unlike people, never pretended to be something they weren't. Lord Whitmore listened without interrupting, occasionally turning a page back to check a figure, asking questions that grew sharper and more specific as the conversation went on. Not the questions of a man testing her honesty, but of a man genuinely trying to understand the shape of the problem in front of him. "These figures," he said finally, tapping the dairy accounts, "are yours. They are. You've turned a profit here. In a year your father was actively bleeding the estate dry elsewhere. I managed the dairy myself. I have for 3 years. He looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The look of a man discovering he had misjudged the shape of a problem he thought he'd already understood. Your family doesn't mention this, he observed. My family doesn't mention very much about me that isn't a complaint. Eleanor hadn't meant to say it so plainly, but exhaustion had worn away whatever instinct usually kept her guarded. I'm not the sort of daughter people brag about at dinner parties, my lord. I'm the sort they're grateful he didn't offer sympathy when the accounts she was grateful for. Sympathy from a stranger holding the mortgage on her home would have felt unbearable. Instead, he closed the ledger carefully and sat back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her, stubbornly, refuse to. I did not come here today expecting to find someone who understood their own finances better than most men I do business with in London, he said. I confess I don't know quite what to do with the discovery. You could start, Eleanor said dryly, by not calling in the debt in 30 days. I can save this farm, my lord. I simply need more time than my father's mistakes have left me. He did not agree immediately. He returned to the county town without giving her an answer, and Eleanor spent the following week in a state of grim, exhausting preparation, drawing up a full accounting of every asset the farm possessed, every debt owed to it by tenants who could reasonably be expected to pay, every improvement she believed could turn a modest profit within a year if given the chance. She did not do this because she expected it to move him. She did it because it was the only thing within her power to control, and because, whatever happened, she intended to face the loss of her home with a clear accounting of exactly what she had tried, rather than the vague, helpless grief her father had drowned in during his final months. Lord Whitmore returned 8 days later, unannounced, and found her in the dairy barn, sleeves rolled to her elbows, elbow deep in the business of the farm rather than dressed for a visit she hadn't known to expect. You didn't send word, she said, wiping her hands on her apron, aware of how she must look to him. Nothing like the women he likely encountered in London drawing rooms. I found I didn't much care to give you time to prepare a performance, he said. I wanted to see the farm as it actually is. And what do you make of it? He walked the length of the barn slowly, taking in the neat rows of dairy equipment, the careful, deliberate organization that bore no resemblance to the chaos of her father's abandoned ledgers. I make of it, he said finally, that you have been running this operation with considerably more competence than the man who inherited it by right of birth. That's not a difficult standard to exceed, my lord. No, he agreed. But it is, I think, the first honest thing anyone in your family situation has managed to show me. He proposed, then, an arrangement that startled her with its practicality. An extension on the debt, structured against the farm's actual income rather than her father's speculative fictions, with terms that would allow her, not a husband, not a male relative but Eleanor herself, to manage the repayment directly, so long as the accounts were kept as rigorously as the ones she'd already shown him. You would extend this to me, she said carefully, knowing I have no husband, no father, nothing but my own management to guarantee it? I would extend it to competence, he said. I find I have very little patience left for pretending that title and gender are reliable indicators of either honesty or ability. You have demonstrated both, in circumstances that would have broken most people I know. Over the months that followed, what began as a business arrangement settled, gradually and without either of them quite naming it, into something else. Lord Whitmore visited Ashcombe more often than the terms of the debt required, ostensibly to review the accounts, though their conversations increasingly wandered far beyond ledgers and rents, into her opinions on tenant farming reforms, his own frustrations with an aristocratic world that valued birth over judgment, the quiet, companionable understanding of two people who had each, in their own way, learned to distrust easy flattery. Eleanor's sisters, when word eventually reached them that a lord had taken a personal interest in Ashcombe's affairs, arrived with a flurry of unsolicited advice about how she ought to conduct herself, what she ought to wear, how she might finally make herself agreeable enough to secure an advantageous match after years of being overlooked. You've always been too plain to attract this sort of attention on your own merits, Charlotte said, not unkindly. simply stating what the family had always believed as fact. You mustn't waste the opportunity through stubbornness. Eleanor, standing in the dairy she had kept running through 3 years of her father's decline, looked at her sister with something that was no longer hurt, only a tired, settled clarity. He isn't here for my face, Charlotte. He's here because I know how to keep a farm from ruin, which is more than anyone in this family ever credited me for. When Lord Whitmore finally asked her, not in a drawing room, but in the dairy barn, surrounded by the ordinary evidence of the work she had built with her own hands, whether she would consider a partnership that extended beyond the terms of a debt, Eleanor did not need to ask what he meant. I've spent my whole life being useful and never once being wanted, she said. I find I don't know how to trust the difference. Then let me be plain, since it seems to be the only language you fully trust, he said. I want the woman who rebuilt this farm out of her father's ruin, who kept meticulous accounts through grief no one acknowledged, who looked at a stranger holding her family's debt and negotiated with him as an equal rather than begging for mercy. I do not want a wife who requires managing. I want a partner who already knows how. The wedding, when it came, was a quiet affair at Ashcombe itself, in the same kitchen where the ledgers had first been laid across the table between them. Eleanor's sisters attended, still faintly bewildered by a match neither beauty nor charm had secured, unable to fully articulate what exactly had made their plain, practical sister more valuable than either of them had ever been taught to consider themselves. Eleanor didn't need them to understand it. She had spent years believing her worth was measured only in what she could not offer. Beauty, softness, the easy charm her sisters wielded without effort. It had taken a stranger arriving to collect a debt to show her that the very things her family had dismissed as plainness were, to the right person, the entire foundation of a life worth building. The farm, in the years that followed, did not merely survive. It flourished, not through inherited grace or fortunate marriage alone, but through the same rigorous, unglamorous competence that had kept it standing through its worst years, now finally recognized as the asset it had always been. If Eleanor's story reminded you that being overlooked isn't the same as being without worth, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever underestimated your quiet strength, the way Eleanor's family did? Share this video with someone who deserves to be seen for who they truly are.